Good afternoon, good morning, whichever it is for you. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to take a deep breath during the break. My name is Rachel Faulkner. I am the Director of Community Investments at the SRE Network, and I am so pleased and feeling so honored to welcome you to our Creating an SRE Workplace for All panel. Well, I could go in for a long time just describing what the panel will be about. I'm actually so excited to introduce you to our panelists that I'm not going to do that. We have Feldblum, who is the former commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Dena Robinson, who is a civil rights attorney and a DEI facilitator and consultant. Thank you so much, Hi and Dena, for being willing to share your wisdom, thoughts, and experiences with us today. I'm so excited to dive in. And with that, Dena, I'd love to start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What's the work you do in the world? And I think for our SRE members, we'd love to hear especially why you do that work.
Thanks, Rachel. And hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. It's an honor to be here and to be on this panel. My name is Dena Robinson. I am a first-generation Black, Jewish, and queer woman. I am a civil rights attorney, as Rachel shared. I practice employment litigation, and I'm also a diversity, equity, and inclusion facilitator and consultant and co-founder of Radical Roots Consulting. My expertise lays in the areas of storytelling, adult learning, virtual in-person facilitation, curriculum design, and design thinking or equity-based design thinking. And one of the reasons why I do this work is because as a first generation American, as a Black woman, as a Jewish woman, I know that we have to do so much work in creating the world to come. We don't have a blueprint for the world that we hope to build. And I want to build a radical world where Black people, especially Black women, can just be and can be free. And so I do the work that I do every day, both as a civil rights attorney and as a DEI consultant and facilitator, to really dismantle systems of oppression, systems of white supremacy for Black liberation and ultimately for collective liberation.
Thank you. Hi, I would love to hear a little bit about you, who you are, why you do the work that you do.
So again, welcome to everyone. I love it that we're going to be across the country. So good morning or good afternoon. And I also am just totally psyched about having this panel and in fact, meeting Dena. and that's all awesome, which is so much of what this is about, is working together. So I too, actually am first generation on one side. My father was a Holocaust survivor and came here after the war, after surviving in the forests of Poland, actually. And I actually grew up planning to be a Talmudic studies scholar, which is what he was. And then I switched to more modern law by becoming a lawyer. And I just feel so fortunate in what I've been able to do with my legal career. I mean, the late 1980s, I was the lead lawyer helping to draft and negotiate the Americans with Disabilities Act. Then I had the great fortune of being able to teach at Georgetown Law School as a professor for about 18 years. And mentoring students was huge to me then. It's incredibly important to me now as well, in terms of mentoring the next generation of folks who are going to be taking on this work. And then I was appointed as a commissioner to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, and that's a position that has to be confirmed by the Senate. So I went through Senate confirmation twice. Not necessarily anything that is huge fun, especially I'm an out lesbian and I'd actually written a lot on LGBTQ rights, which, caused some controversy. But the main thing for here is that even though the EEOC is primarily an enforcement agency, it has responsibility for enforcing the federal employment civil rights laws. I and many others at the EEOC really came together to forge a path for employers and organizations to stop harassment before it happened, before there was a charge at the EEOC, and to affirmatively increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. So after I left the commission, I did that DEI work for just 2 years, not as much as Dena, but about 2 years at a great law firm called Morgan Lewis. And then a few months ago, I decided to take early semi-retirement, and I am just reveling in helping groups and organizations for free, doing the same thing, doing the civil rights work that I love.
Great, thank you. Enjoy that time. Seems well earned. I want to talk a little bit about the history of SRE. You both know that when SRE first came to be, we really focused on sexual harassment and preventing sexual harassment in the workplace and in Jewish communal spaces broadly. As we've grown as an organization, we've tried to evolve and shift, and we started to expand how we think about safety, respect, and equity. And so I want to start with that sort of shift and that big picture change. So when you think about creating safe, respectful, equitable workplaces, what do you think is important for a workplace to do? What would a workplace look like that was really upholding SRE values? Kai, we'll start with you on that one.
Okay, well, number one, it is so awesome that SRE is expanding in this way. I mean, I knew about SRE before it was SRE, because some of the folks who ended up setting it up came to speak to me at the EOC because I, together with my colleague Vicki Lipnick, had put out a report on preventing harassment, and not just sexual harassment, but harassment on any basis. And in the report, we had talked about the importance of creating safe and respectful workplaces across the board, on all types of bases. So it was great to see SRE starting with that and now expanding. So to your question of what do you think is really important for workplaces to do to create these type of safe, respectful, equitable workplaces? The first thing is what I call know thyself, right? The workplace needs to self-reflect on its culture. You know, you can do a sophisticated cultural assessment. That's something that I've done with a colleague over the last 2 years. You can do something more basic to find out what is the culture. And when I'm talking about culture, I'm talking about a culture in which people feel psychologically safe. And what that means is that people feel safe to speak up about problems or about ideas, and also safe to make mistakes. That's a culture of psychological safety. And the way to get there is for people to feel respected. If people feel respected, then they will feel safe. These are just connected. And then if you do that as the norm for everybody, you can then deal with some of the structural issues we have, whether racism, sexism, issues around disability, etc. So know thyself, I think, is the first most important thing. And then I would say the second thing, in a way it's a no-brainer, but it's sometimes really hard. It is really making sure that the leadership is engaged in the way that it needs to be engaged. You know, the concept it starts at the top, yes, true, you know, but then it's like, thank you for sharing. What does that mean? Starts at the top. And basically it's three things. The leaders have to really believe that they want this safe, respectful, equitable workplace. They need a sort of fire in the belly. They need to articulate it. You know, don't underestimate the power of the written and spoken word. They have to articulate, these are the values that we expect in this workplace to be demonstrated. And third, most important, they have to hold people accountable. They have to hold people accountable if they are not upholding those values. Because leaders say a lot of things, and employees need to feel their leaders are authentic when they say it. So leaders can shape culture. They have to believe it, they have to articulate it, and they have to hold people accountable to the values of that type of workshop or that type of workplace.
Thank you. Dena, anything to
I
add?
Yes, I want to second what Hai said first about reflection. One of the things I've noticed with organizations, both those that I've worked in, those that I've worked with as a civil rights attorney, or those that I've worked with as a consultant, is that most organizations think that they're a lot further ahead than they actually are. And most of them, when they do that self-assessment or that audit, they realize that they're not actually the anti-racist organization that they thought that they were. So I would say reflection is a key part of that, both for the organization as a whole and also for the people who make up that organization. I think sometimes we feel that we can't make change as individuals, but one of the things we have to remember is that individuals make up institutions and systems. And so by shifting ourselves, we can actually shift the institutions that we work for. So the second thing I would say is that organizations need to work on relationship building. One of the things I've seen is that a lot of organizations, especially when it comes to DEI or anything related to a conversation about race or any other aspect of identity, fear conflict. I would push organizations to actually embrace conflict as a way to build relationships, build trust, and build the accountability that Hai was talking about across an organization. Because it seems like when there are breaches and we don't know how to move past those breaches together, that's where a lot of the culture in an organization will start to break down. And culture is something that you can build day to day during your daily interactions with your coworkers. The last thing I would say is norming around language. That's another thing that I've seen go wrong in organizations. We all have different entry points into doing this work, right? And so my definition of racism might be very different from my colleague's definition of what racism means or what it looks like. And so when we norm around language and we have shared definitions of what these terms mean, what they look like, what is a microaggression, what is a breach, what does accountability mean, then we can actually move some of our work forward. But we often aren't speaking the same language when we're having conversations about DEI. And so we kind of end up talking past each other, or we don't talk at all, which is also a problem. And that's why I'm really excited about this standards refresh that SRE has done, because at least everyone will be on the same page about what these different things mean.
Thank you. In answering what an SRE workplace would look like, you both talked about authenticity, reflection, language, leadership, transparency, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those words feel like so inspiring and yet so like weighty to me. So I'm wondering what you're seeing as the challenges and the opportunities around workplaces creating safe, respectful, and equitable workplaces are.
Dena, do you
Looks like
want to pick up or?
Yeah, I'm reflecting on the opportunities piece, and I think that, you know, from what I shared before in the introduction, I do think that we have weighty work as people who are doing DEI related work because the world that we are yearning for does not currently exist. We have no blueprint for it. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what the language is going to be, but we know that we have to get there. And so, one of the unique opportunities that a lot of organizations have in creating safe, respectful, and equitable workplaces is that you can vision, you can think about the longest point that you can see, you can dream it, and then you can create the steps to work towards that vision. And that vision doesn't have to be limited by the law, you know. I think when you think about a statute like Title VII, for example, Title VII is a floor, it's not the ceiling. And so, as an organization, you have the opportunity to go as far as you want, like go beyond Title VII, cover whatever you want, um, as long as you are creating a space that's not only diverse, because diversity is not enough, but you want to create spaces where the people who are most impacted can truly thrive. And I think that that's a really awesome responsibility to have, as weighty and as scary as it is, because you don't know if you're going to make a misstep, and that's okay. And so, a challenge that I would say a lot of organizations face is the fear of failure. Um, and I would push you all to think about ways that you can disrupt white dominant culture. And instead of seeing something as a failure, see that also as an opportunity and a lesson. You're learning something new about your organization's culture. You're learning something new so that the next time a breach happens, you better know how to respond. I think that's the name of the game when it comes to DEI. You know, you're constantly learning and it's a practice, and that's all that you can do as long as you're moving forward.
Yeah, I would definitely underscore some of the opportunities now, because there are a lot of challenges as we come
Mm-hmm.
to that. But, you know, and what I've been doing this work for almost 35, 40 years in terms of some civil rights. I feel like there's a willingness now to learn about structural racism that didn't exist before. I mean, it's existed this whole time. There have been books about it, but there hasn't been a willingness or a sense of urgency on the part of white people to learn about it. And I would say if you do one thing after this convening, and is if you've read some good books that have made a difference to you, tell a friend, and then have them tell a friend. So, like, I can tell you two that I read early on that did make an impact on me, even though, obviously limitations to each book. But White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, I felt like when I was reading it that, boy, any Black friend of mine would be like, "Oh yeah, right, huh?" You know, duh. But for white people, it was, for me, it was good. And Cast by Isabel Wilkerson was another
Mm-hmm.
one, just sort of the history. And then it really struck me because I had read Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates like 2 years ago or something. And I thought, oh yeah, very well written book. And it didn't sort of, that's really all I thought about it. I read it again after reading some other stuff, and I was like, oh, that's what he's saying. So I think for me, it showed the ability to self-educate. Okay, so I think in terms of opportunities, there's a willingness to learn now. And talk about accountability, I feel employees are holding their leaders accountable. The public is holding people accountable, companies, organizations. So those are the opportunities. Now, I do think there are challenges. And when I was thinking about it, I think like sort of the two main challenges, well, echo some of the things you said, Dena, but people don't realize the issues they have. I mean, there can be a very different view from the top than from the
Mm-hmm.
bottom or the middle. So know thyself is sometimes tough. And I think the other thing is people don't realize how long it can take to change culture and the hard work required. This is not a snap your fingers and it happens. And so for me, the other thing that's so important is to engage your people, engage your employees in figuring out what needs to be changed and how to engage your volunteers, engage your congregants. I mean, I did this investigation on behalf of Central Synagogue that has now become public, which is why I can say it. And they were just incredibly committed to finding out what had gone on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that engaging the people who are make up your culture is key. And I feel like I'm still learning it now. And one of my great ways of being able to just help people, I'm helping the Women's Rabbinical Network, which is doing some incredibly good work. So realize that it takes time, but engage the right people.
Great, thank you. Dena, something you said is still sitting with me. I think I'm quoting you directly when I say that you said, make sure that the people who are most impacted can truly thrive. And then, Hi, you kind of added to that in saying that it's really important that there's accountability to make sure that that's happening. And I'm going a little bit off script, so I hope y'all will bear with me. But I'm like really sitting with this and don't want to move on quite yet. I'm wondering how, when we think about actual written policies and standards and things like that, we ensure that they do make sure that the people who are most impacted can truly thrive, and how we hold accountability when we see a divergence from that. And I guess, Dena, since I started with your quote, I'll ask you to answer first.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about that. So one aspect of accountability that I don't think we talk about often, and this came up with the Derek Chauvin verdict, right? People were saying, "Oh, this is accountability. This is accountability." Some people were saying it was justice, and I disagreed with both of those things, because for me, accountability isn't just being literally held accountable for doing something wrong. So getting some type of sanction at your workplace, being disciplined, that is accountability light, I think. But when I think about accountability, I'm thinking about it through the lens of restorative justice principles, and accountability being the acknowledgement that a breach against one person is actually a breach against everyone in that community. And what we see happen in workplaces is, two coworkers say are having a disagreement. Um, it's based on race or gender, let's say. That breach isn't between those two people. Everything about the culture changes when those two people are in conflict with each other. And so if the workplace doesn't address that conflict, address that harm or a breach has occurred both between those two people and between everyone in the organization as a whole, I think regardless of what the organization does at that point to address the conflict, I wouldn't say that that's true accountability, because there was still harm that happened that went unaddressed. I think accountability has also changed behavior. And so, one of the things I've seen both as an employee and as a consultant is a breach happens, there's a shift in policies, and then the same circumstance occurs again and nothing has changed. And that shows me that even though there was a change in a policy or a practice, that's not true accountability. True accountability to me would be change behavior. So um, I think part of it is making policies in workplaces that center those most impacted. So if you're making a policy around sexual harassment, let's say, or racial harassment, I would want to see the people who have been harmed in the past by that conduct having a seat at the table when making those policies. I think often people who are most impacted are not necessarily in positions of power to be the ones who are actually drafting the policies. It's usually people who are a little bit disconnected who are drafting the language, and then going to people afterwards and they're like, oh, do you like this language that we drafted on your behalf? So I think folks who have been harmed in the past or are likely to be harmed given what we know to be true about our society and historical context, I think they should be the ones who are centered in that drafting.
Yeah, I agree. And then just adding some additional ideas to that. So, number one, policies are absolutely essential. The standards
Mm-hmm.
are essential. Thrilled that SRE has did the standards originally, do the refresh of standards. That's why I said, in terms of leadership, after the fire in the belly, is you have to articulate it, and so you have to articulate it in the policies. Um, I agree that you want to have those policies talk about actual things that happen in that particular workplace, and you'll know that best if you can engage the people who are impacted. Particularly important for things like microaggressions that folks who are not in that community, whether it's race or sex or disability, LGBTQ status, whatever, just may not be aware. And one of the things that we developed off of some of the work at the EOC is what we call the corrective action matrix. And it's basically a process by which the organization figures out types of conduct that they won't allow. And they do it in order of severity so that you can start with not such severe behavior, but behavior that the entity doesn't want to tolerate. And we tend to start with conduct that's not even status based, just disrespectful or bullying generally, and then status based uh, behavior, misconduct, starting from not so severe. But that's a really good way to involve folks to actually come up with examples. So, very important in terms of the policies to have them there. And then in terms of the accountability, I completely agree with Dena in terms of the breach affects not just the two people, and not, let's say, the one person who might be the object of it. It is the culture. It is other people, which is why sort of flipping it, I think there's the role that, and I say flipping it in the sense of not just thinking about adverse impact on the other people, but now empowering those other people to do something positive. And this is what I think the whole bystander intervention approach is so important. And it really wasn't something in the workplace. It was something that when we were doing the report at EOC in 2016, we learned from the educational context. But the idea being that if you see something bad happening, it is your responsibility to do something. It does have something to do with you. And often people don't intervene either because they think it doesn't affect them, or they don't want it being turned on them, sort of any adverse behavior, or they just don't know what to do, you know? And for an organization to say, we know that bad behavior adversely affects everyone, so we want to teach everyone the skills on how to stop that behavior happening if they see it. And we want to give you accolades and encouragement if you do that. So it's not easy to have that accountability or, again, to build that culture, but it is doable. You just have to take the first step and then the second and then the third.
Great. We are nearing the end of our time, and I feel like we could talk forever, but I'd actually love to shift gears a little bit for our final question and hear how your Jewish values impact your work in the SRE space. Dena?
Oh my goodness. So much. I'm thinking about a course that I recently took in this peer-led Jewish community that I'm a part of, where we were diving really deeply into Musar. And for folks who are not aware, Musar is almost like Jewish character development. And a lot of it was around humility, intention setting, having patience with people, sweetening anger with compassion. And so, one of the reasons why I do the work that I do, both as a civil rights attorney and as a DEI consultant, is because I take the promise of Tikkun Olam very seriously. I think that we have one life on this earth, and I want to make sure that for the time that I'm here, I'm doing the work that I need to do to at least plant seeds for a liberated future for the people who will come after me. I want to be a good ancestor one day, and I want to make good of Tikkun Olam. I think that we can repair the world. I think all of us have a moral imperative too, and some people would disagree with me on that. But I think that, literally is the rent that we pay for living in these bodies for this time on this earth. And so my Jewish values call me to work for liberation, call me to work against enslavement, whatever that enslavement looks like, whether it's enslavement to work or enslavement to capitalism or enslavement to white supremacy. My Jewish values tell me to speak truth to power literally. And I find ways to do that. And honestly, some of the work that I do, especially in the DEI space, is one of the spaces where I feel I live into those values the most. So it's always been a guiding light and a North Star for me to a certain extent, and a way for me to live that out in real time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because absolutely Tikkun Olam is something that, I learned about obviously as a kid from the very beginning. It was so ingrained in us. Again, I mean, I grew up as a very Orthodox Jew, and I'm not anymore, but that's absolutely what shaped me and the values I've since taken from there. So Tikkun Olam, it's back to the thing is, yes, you are responsible, and yeah, you can't fix everything, but we all know just because you can't finish the work doesn't mean you don't start it. And to me, that has been, again, sort of the North Star. I think the other piece and I've always framed it simply as generosity of spirit. Just have a generosity of spirit. And it means not being judgmental when that's not going to be helpful. Being open and being caring and having the compassion. And I think you're right. So much of that is in Musar, but so I would say my Jewish values absolutely impact my work in this space.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kai. Thank you so much, Dena. You've shared so much knowledge and wisdom with us. And with that, we are going to turn it over to the audience so that we can ask and answer some questions live. And we are live, ready to answer and ask questions of Dena and Kai. So if you have those questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And I want to ask one more question before we get to those live questions. We've talked a lot thus far in our conversation about safety and respect and equity through a racial justice lens. I'm wondering, as we broaden to safety and respect and equity to everyone and making sure that everyone can thrive in the workplace, who are we talking about? Who are the folks we need to be paying special attention to, thinking about especially, and why is thinking about intersectionality specifically so important as we talk about SRE? Dena, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. You know, intersectionality is important because, as Audre Lorde would say, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And intersectionality teaches us that systems and institutions impact our differing identities. So, for me as a Black woman, I do not have the same experiences walking through certain institutions, let's say healthcare, as a white woman. And so, if we were going to talk about gender based discrimination, we would need to account for the fact that as a Black person, I might be doubly burdened in some ways. And as a queer woman, I face another burden when it comes to how I interact with these systems and these institutions. In terms of who we're centering, I personally believe, as a DEI facilitator and consultant, that we need to center the people who are most impacted, and we need to center the people who are most at the margins. I think when we, think about social design, for example, if you design around the people who are going to have the most limited access to a program, you're not just benefiting that group of people who are most impacted, you're benefiting everyone else as well. And when I was a teacher, I would tell people all the time, if you design your classroom to benefit English language learners, it will benefit everyone, even native English speakers, because of some of the accommodations that we were putting in place. And I think that's true when we think about our workplaces as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think that it really mattered to SRE in putting together this event to get people who are presenting who are not only intersectional, because we all are, but also being out about it. So again, your gender, your race ordinarily will be manifest, but as someone with a hidden psychiatric disability of anxiety disorder, as someone who's a lesbian, these are things that you don't know unless I come out about it. And the fact is to create a culture that is safe for people to come out with whomever they are. And some of those characteristics are characteristics that have been stigmatized or marginalized in society, all the more important. So, and again, it's like in disability, we say all the time, it's universal design, right? Design it in a way that will accommodate people with disabilities. So they're just standing in the same space as everyone else. They're not like on a ramp, on a tilt that makes it harder for them. Then you're going to help everyone else, right? How many of us who are not have impairments or mobility get to use those side cuts, in the ramp?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I was most excited about when thinking about this panel is that I think, as far as I know, it's the first time that a panel full of folks that identify as queer women are talking about something other than being queer women in the Jewish space. And so we're talking about like folks broadly, but like this is groundbreaking in itself. And that actually brings me to one of the audience questions. Dena, you talked about how making sure that folks are centered, who are most impacted, are centered. There's a question from the audience about what that really means. Does that mean that folks that should be harmed should have a seat at the table to create the policies? Should they be addressing what should happen in terms of restorative justice and corrective action in a specific incident? Where do we make sure that folks who are harmed have been centered in our conversations?
That's a great question. It makes me think about the cycle of action, which essentially says that usually the status quo is that you gain awareness of a problem and then you jump into fixing it and you don't go through all of these other steps. And the cycle of action from a racial equity standpoint or any equity standpoint really asks us to slow down and to walk through what is essentially a community organizing process. So we focus on building relationships with the people who are most impacted. Then we engage in analysis with them to figure out what the problems are. And at each step in the cycle of action, the people who are most impacted have a seat at the table. And I think that that's how it should be in workplaces as well. Usually, what ends up happening, unfortunately, is that we design things without people who are most impacted having a seat at the table. And then we come back to them and we're like, so do you like it? Do you like this policy that we made for you? Does it work? You know, and in doing so, one, that's inefficient because then you're going to have to go back and fix it again, when you could have just had those people having a seat at the table. So I think in all aspects of creating a workplace or creating a policy or creating a committee, it's important to not just go to the people who are most impacted to ask for their input, but to give them enough power so that they can make their vision true and come alive in whatever it is that you're setting up.
Thank you. And then, hi, we had a follow-up question for you too around normalizing speaking out, coming forward when it may require a loss of confidentiality, anonymity. How do we work to make sure that folks feel safe coming forward?
Well, folks will feel safe coming forward if there's not only no retaliation if they come forward and say something about themselves, but in fact, a positive response, positive acknowledgement. I mean, I think we all know from having sort of mentored to some, younger queer folks, or even, folks who are older who are so afraid of coming out because of the possible negative impact. And then often it's not as bad as as they feared. I mean, there really is that difference, but then it has to be that it really isn't bad. So that is, I mean, it's really connected to being proactive and not reactive. It's about understanding that we tend to think that society, including the society of our workplace, is made up of people like us. And instead to think, no, who could all the people here be? And let's set up a structure and a culture in which people will feel comfortable. I mean, it's both very simple and sometimes very difficult to effectuate.
Dena, you have extra thoughts?
Well, the one thing I was going to say is I was actually talking to my partner about this last night because I think a lot of employers will ask their employees to bring their most authentic self into the workplace. And sometimes you do, and then you get penalized for it because the workplace isn't yet the type of community where they're going to be comfortable with whatever authentic self you're bringing to work every day. And so I'm thinking about the balance between people doing that and employees feeling brave and courageous enough to be their most authentic self at work, but also the burden that employers have to actually do the work to change their workplace culture so that that same employee who's authentic isn't later penalized for showing up as the self that the employer said that they wanted all along. So I'm thinking about that. And I'm also thinking about how one of the reasons I think we have issues in the workplace around authenticity or creating safe workplaces is a fear of conflict. And so I just wanted to name conflict is actually a really good thing in workplaces, and it's not something that you should shy away from because conflict helps us to deepen our relationships. It helps us to move past the hard issue that we're talking about, and it helps us to get to the other side. Well, sometimes depending on how you engage in the conflict intact. So I just wanted to name that as an element that can change the workplace.
And if I could also add something in terms of the confidentiality question, because that's especially the case for people with hidden disabilities and hidden psychiatric disabilities in particular. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to come out about that. Certainly, not to everyone, because no matter how much training you might give people, if they're going to have a stigma about, you have anxiety disorder, that means you can't do this or that project. You don't want to cause that hurt to yourself. But if you need some accommodation, in order to be able to perform to your highest potential, you don't want your fear of someone knowing that information to stop you from, in fact, performing well. So it is sort of a cycle. Like, that's why I think it's so important that people who are in leadership positions come out about hidden disabilities. It's why, I mean, for me, you know, for my anxiety disorder, it actually, you know, got it medicated early, therapy early, 30 years ago. I mean, it really hasn't affected my life professionally, but I so often try to come out in order to let other people know that that's maybe something that they shouldn't have to worry about coming out about. But it's so individualized. It's so individualized. And you don't want to harm yourself. So it's really about talking with maybe colleagues whom you can trust, you know. And again, if the workplace has set up a structure in which they are engaging their employees affirmatively, upfront, proactively, then that's a space in which people can bring forward these issues. So I'm a big believer in creating an employee-driven diversity, equity, inclusion committee, and really empowering that group to work in partnership with whoever the leadership is on that. And there are lots of ways to set that up very effectively. So I really like that approach.
Yes, thank you. In thinking about establishing diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, I feel like it ties back to this idea of healthy conflict. And there are a few questions about specific examples of healthy conflict or embracing conflict in the workplace in order to lay the groundwork for increased SRE. So wondering if you have specific examples, especially as they relate to countering white supremacy culture around the way an organization has really embraced healthy conflict and tough conversation and moving the needle against some opposition.
I'll say it's definitely a challenge for a lot of organizations from what I've seen. And I think honestly, a lot of it is because of white fragility. For example, the workplace that I was in previously doing an appellate litigation fellowship, we had a DEI committee. We had values that were guiding us in terms of conflict, but sometimes those values were being weaponized against Black and Brown staff members. And so when we would go to call in a white colleague into the same values that we had, these agreements, right? Then we were told that we were being too aggressive or we were hurting their feelings by being direct, which is what the values called us to do. But I think that a positive example I can think of is another Jewish community that I'm a part of. It's entirely peer run. Our active membership is about probably around 200 people around the country and around the world. And we've had to engage in a lot of serious and uncomfortable conversations about race because our community's membership is majority white. And with that comes a whole host of issues when, you know, you consider the fact that there are people of color in the community as well. And one of the ways that we've been able to engage in healthy conflict is by having one-on-one conversations. We like to use the Courageous Conversations compass and tell the other person when we're having these one-on-one conversations what lens we're bringing to it. So I had a conflict with a white coworker, and I let him know, you know, when you sent me this email, it made me feel like you didn't think that I could do this. And I know I can do this, you know. And so he shared where he was coming from, and we were able to find some common ground of understanding using the Courageous Conversations compass. So I think it is possible, but I think a big part of it is being direct. And I don't think that being direct is something that a lot of workplaces actually value because sometimes someone being direct can, you know, it stings a little and it hurts and you're like, oh, ouch, you know. But we need to build up the muscle to be able to move past that initial discomfort if we want to become a society filled with workplaces and communities that can actually have hard conversations and come out on the other side whole.
Yeah. You know, a lot of this is learning the skills of how to give feedback and receive feedback. which is
Mhm.
not something that as humans we're necessarily it's easy to do. And it's interesting because I spent a year sort of working with revising Fran Sepler's workplace civility training. Fran is just an amazing person in this area. And so much of it was telling people that the way to make the workplace better was to give feedback when something was hurtful. Like, that's the only way that other people are going to learn that that's important. But then the other thing is teaching the skill of how to receive that feedback, right? Because it doesn't feel good in the moment.
Mhm.
But, as I would always say, so when you get a gift that you don't like, what do you say? Thank you. Thank you. I know exactly what I'll do with this. Right? That people have to understand that feedback is actually a gift because the person could just shut up about it and not say anything. It's not easy to give feedback. It wouldn't have been easy for you, Dena, to send that email. That's
Mhm.
out there. So realize that it's a gift. Say thank you, take a breath, and then try to learn more. Don't try to go into defense mode. Just say, tell me more. And that's how we're going to learn. And by the way, I think White Fragility is a very helpful book to read, as I think I've said. So,
And another good book for folks is Celeste Headley wrote a book called How to Have Conversations That Matter, or We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter, that helps people to build that muscle. Because I think a part of the problem to what you were saying is that people aren't necessarily always listening to understand, right? We're listening to respond. And I've had that too, where people have come to give me feedback and I'm like, oh, what are they talking? And, I'm an attorney. And so a part of what I'm doing as they're speaking is I'm like coming up with all of these holes that I'm about to tell them. And I'm going to say, oh no, well, I actually didn't say it this way. I said it that way, instead of listening to hear what they're saying. And one thing I found helpful when in conflict with other people is, I'm coming to you in a spirit of radical honesty and because I want to deepen this relationship with you. Because if I wasn't interested in deepening the relationship, I'd just be like, oh, well, all right, and go about my business. But I want to be in relationship with this person. I'm inviting them to be in relationship with me. And I'll usually say to someone, right now, I just want you to listen. I don't want you to respond. I don't want you to defend why you did what you did. I want you to just hear how this is landing with me in this moment. And then we can revisit this conversation later.
Thank you. We're being asked to take our show on the road, so I feel like we're getting somewhere good. I'm wondering if y'all can speak specifically to pressure points within the Jewish institutional world with Jewish institutional leadership, particularly folks who might be resistant to substantial change or to change that really addresses a wide audience.
mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I'll start on that. It's sort of a truism that it starts at the top, right? And then that's sort of like, thank you for sharing. What does that mean? I think we want to not only say it starts at the top, we really want to unpack what that means. And so, in terms of the pressure points, where to make change, it really has to be the leaders of whatever that particular organization is. It's our rabbis, it's our cantors, right? If you're in those types of institutions, um, it's the leaders being willing to hold others accountable, and hold them accountable in a public way if that's what is necessary to send a message. So, very important pressure point in terms of the leadership. And then the other thing, it sort of comes back to what we've said before. You have to make people feel safe in coming forward, right? That's it's the top, the middle, and the bottom. But I really think it's important not just to say the words, it comes from the top, but to really unpack for oneself in one's organization what that would mean in practice.
I agree. I honestly have nothing to add to that response.
Great. I'm wondering then if we can think of like specific next steps. I turn off the convening tomorrow and I'm back in my regular workday. Like, what is the first thing I should be considering doing for my organization, for the broader Jewish community?
Hmm. I would say take some time to reflect or journal on how some of these conversations today have been coming up for you. I think we often discount how much oppression actually lives in our bodies. And I'm talking about oppression that comes from racialization, oppression that comes from living in a heteronormative society, oppression that comes from living in a patriarchal society. And I think that we need to spend some time sitting with that and sitting with that discomfort and practicing sitting with that discomfort so that we can then go into our workplaces and build deep, authentic relationships with our colleagues or with the people that we supervise. So that would be step one for me personally. And then step two would be work on building relationships with your colleagues. You know, I see a lot of people, and I'm talking specifically about race right now because I think that race is one of the dominant ways that we move through systems and institutions, specifically in the United States. And I've heard people say, oh, you know, my colleagues don't talk to me about racism. And there's a reason why your colleagues might not talk to you about some of the oppression that they're facing in their lives. And so you want to build deep and authentic relationships with your colleagues so that people don't have to keep coming into the workplace and leaving half of their identities at the door, because that's exhausting and it is triggering and it can make for a very anxious work environment where you're not bringing your best self because you're not bringing your fullest self. So I would say those two things, just reflection on your identities, how you're situated to power, how the content for this convening is sitting with you in your body, and then going and doing the work of building deep relationships, because I really think that from relationships, everything else in a workplace will flow.
Yeah, I love that, Dina. It's so interesting because I often say in my steps, if I'm talking to someone, providing, counseling, how to do this is the first thing is know thyself. And usually what I'm thinking about is know what's going on in your organization, right? And so maybe you want to do a cultural assessment or, there are various tools what one can use. But I'm so glad that you reinforced that the first step of know thyself is thyself. And I
Mm-hmm.
think if, and after the convening ends tomorrow, to really write down like what things struck me. And especially because the issues of sexism and sexual harassment is so huge. If you're a woman, to think what may have happened to me that I didn't really focus on before, that actually does matter, that I just sort of said, oh, well, that's just how things are. Just see, can you
Mm-hmm.
articulate? And for a guy to think, huh, do I ever think, am I ever worried like, oh, did they say that to me because I'm a guy? Like, have you ever thought that? Because I think maybe a lot of guys don't. And the same thing, did you ever think, oh, did they say that because I'm white? I mean, it's just not particularly salient. But I do think the second part of know thyself is know thy organization, and that is about creating the conversations. And I'm a big believer in doing a cultural assessment because that's going to help you target more the work you need to do.
Mm.
Thank you. Such thorough answers. And I could talk to you forever, but we have about 2 minutes left. So wondering if there's anything you weren't asked that you were hoping to touch on, any last thoughts, messages, inspirational wisdom for us.
Um, one thing that came up for me a second ago that I was just reflecting on is that if you have received feedback at your organization in the past, specifically from people who are most impacted within that organization, um, sit with some of that feedback, because usually the people who have the most honest assessment about an organization's culture are the people who are the most impacted within the organization. And usually those same people have the experience of not being heard, and not having their concerns actually addressed, which then further erodes the accountability and the trust within that organization. So I would say if you have received feedback in the past, whether it's in the past year or the past 5 years, I would sit with some of that feedback and sit with how it makes you feel. And I also echo doing a cultural assessment, because all of those things together at least show to your employees that you are taking this seriously. And not only that you're willing to do these things, but that you're willing to do the work of changing the workplace culture. And the last thing I would say is that, we need to do the work of practicing the world that we hope to see one day. And so sit with whether you are living out your organization's values, sit with whether you are actually staying true to your personal mission and values that you have for doing this work, and align your behavior and your actions accordingly.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rachel, when you asked that, what I thought about was values. So really exactly, Dena, what you just ended with. I mean, when I was doing this work generally in terms of anti-harassment, which is where it started, so much was it had to be tailored to what that actual workplace was like, what that actual neighborhood organization was like. I mean, it really has to be tailored. And I was so proud that the Jewish community was coming together in what became SRE to say, what is specific about the Jewish community that we need to build on? So not only what we're responsible to have as a Jewish community, but how do we use the values that we've already all committed to, and then make sure that they're being applied in this way. So, gosh, if everyone just, again, at the end of the convening, really thought about how do I leverage the power that my Jewish values are already playing in the work I do, and now focus that on some of these issues that have been highlighted.
I love that so much. I feel like I could close, but what better close is that. So thank you both for so much wisdom, so much enlightenment, and for sharing so much of your knowledge with us. If folks would like to reach either of our panelists, please feel free to email convening@srenetwork.org, and we will forward your message on. Thank you again. So glad to have you here.
Thank you.